We have one of the guys, he's special counsel for the Thomas More Society. His name is Christopher Ferrara. Hi, Christopher. How are you?
Hi, Glenn. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity.
Sure. You bet. Now, you are a Catholic society, and you have joined with this Orthodox community. They and a couple of rabbis and a couple of priests, if I'm not mistaken, and you're suing New York. Tell me about it.
That's right. We're suing on behalf of a couple of Catholic priests in New York's North Country, which is up by the Canadian border, and several practitioners of the Orthodox Jewish religion in Brooklyn, which is down south. In the south, we're in phase one, moving into phase two of this cockamamie reopening plan, which has done nothing but destroy jobs. And in the northern section, which is in phase three, we have somewhat looser restrictions on gatherings. But nevertheless, religious gatherings in the state of New York are subject to peculiar restrictions. So indoors right now, they're limited to 25% of capacity. The only such limitation in all of the capacity limitations in this plan. Various offices and other businesses are either at 50% capacity indoors or 100% capacity indoors, including homeless shelters, for example. So we're arguing in federal court that there's a discriminatory application of these guidelines that impacts religion adversely. And now, with the George Floyd demonstrations, thousands upon thousands of people thronging the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, Mayor de Blasio participating in a huge rally at Cadman Plaza. We're arguing that those demonstrations, quite simply, expose the whole regulatory regime as a total sham. It's all theater. Because there's nothing worse in terms of a super spreading event than thousands of people standing shoulder to shoulder, screaming and yelling. And that's what they're permitting. And when they're asked about it, Blasio and Cuomo both essentially say, and we have quotes from transcripts, that, well, this is such an important movement, you see. This is a protest and injustice, and so we have to allow it. And you know what? Fine. That's a First Amendment protected activity. The argument we're making now is, yes, fine, let them protest, but don't pretend that you're enforcing a generally applicable and neutral law at this point, because you're not. You're creating massive exceptions for the protest activities you favor, and you're discriminating against, in particular, the Jewish groups in Brooklyn. So at this very moment, while they're allowing mass demonstrations in the lower part of the state in Manhattan, they're chasing Jewish children out of parks in Brooklyn, and they're chain locking parks.
So Christopher, why do you think
of 30 or 40?
Why do you think this is happening? Why do you think that it is anti-religion, anti-Semitism, or do they not even believe what the stuff that they've been shoveling for a while? Why is this happening like this?
You know, we don't even have to get to the question of whether they harbor any specific animus toward religion. What we do have to show is what is quite obvious now at this point, that they're favoring secular activities over religious activities for whatever reason. So they make value judgments in favor of protests, and they make value judgments in favor of certain businesses and other activities, and they don't make the same value judgments in favor of religion. Well, that means that the scheme of regulations is neither generally applicable nor neutral. Now, what does that mean legally? It means that if you have a system of exemptions and prohibitions and the impact is on religion, you have to have a compelling state interest for that. And the regulations have to be narrowly tailored so that you don't harm religion any more than is absolutely necessary. Well, there's no narrow tailoring. What's the narrow tailoring?
Right. If they would have come out and said, hey, we understand your First Amendment rights. We don't condone this. We urge you to stay inside. And they were saying consistently the same kind of stuff, but they would have had to have a crackdown on it because that's what they've been doing to the religious community. If they would have done that, you would have a hard case. But what they chose to do instead, how is this going to spend more than 10 minutes in court?
Well, there's an obvious problem, and it's a huge problem, and they can't overcome it. So, like I said a few moments ago, the fact that they granted this massive exception for tremendous demonstrations, thronging bridges and plazas, destroys the whole public health rationale for this entire cockamamie scheme of regulations, which is increasingly ridiculous, by the way, as the days go by. For example, you look at the office guidelines now for phase 2. If you're in an office, you have to be 6 feet away from all the other employees in the office. And if any of them comes closer than 6 feet, you have to slap a mask on your face right away. And then when the employee gets further away than 6 feet, you take the mask off. How are you supposed to operate an office like that? It's just a contraption of bureaucratic contrivances that gets dreamt up in some office somewhere. So you're right about that point. If they had said, well, we'll just tolerate this because we can't do anything about it, but you really should stay home, that would be one thing. But they're still defending it as just in itself that there are these mass demonstrations. Just a couple of days ago, June 16th, the mayor was asked point blank, how do you justify allowing these massive protests when you don't let people gather outside bars? And you know what he said? I'll quote it for you. I understand when people ask that. And I think we just have to keep it in perspective. We're seeing a social movement growing before our very eyes that's addressing 400 years of oppressive reality in this country, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, this is such an important movement. Well, we just have to allow, but you can't congregate outside of a bar with 10 or 20 people. So we'll allow 50,000 to march, but none of these block parties, please, because we have to enforce social distancing. So that's why I say the whole thing is being exposed as a sham. When it was put to the test of neutrality with a protest movement, it collapsed. And now we see what it really is, just a bunch of value judgments masquerading as a public health regimen to meet with an emergency. And it's not that at all.
So what is the goal of the lawsuit? I mean, what is the, I think, best thing that we could expect coming out of this? What would it change?
Well, let's talk about the outdoors first. In New Jersey, Governor Murphy did the same thing. He led these protests. He praised these protests. He said they're so important, we just have to allow them. But when the public outcry came, he at least had the honesty with Executive Order 152 to say that, okay, all outdoor gatherings are now conducted without limitation if they are for a religious or a political purpose. So he said basically, oh, what was I thinking? Yes, everybody has First Amendment rights to demonstrate outdoors or engage in religion outdoors. So we're saying in the New York suit, the governor of New York and the mayor of New York City should have the intellectual honesty to do the same thing. So there should no longer be any restriction whatsoever on any kind of outdoor gathering. It just isn't justified. There haven't been any spikes that we know of following these massive demonstrations. And so where's the scientific or public health rationale? It's gone. So zero limitation outdoors. What about indoors? Well, we're arguing that if you can let homeless shelters operate at 100% capacity, and they're filled with the older, more vulnerable populations who are sleeping overnight in the shelters or in the drop-in shelters, they're staying there all day long in close quarters, then how can you say that a synagogue or a church should be limited to 25% capacity? Doesn't make any sense. So we're arguing that the indoor restrictions should be eliminated and we should be treated the same as the most favored businesses under this scheme. For example, supermarkets, bagel shops. How's this for irony? There's a bagel shop across the street from one of the synagogues in Brooklyn. Bagel shop is packed with people. You go across the street to the synagogue. It was 10 people only before, and now they say 25% capacity, which, by the way, is with many of these small synagogues, that's the same thing because they only hold about 40 people. So we're asking for a parity of treatment. Treat religion the same as the favored businesses indoors. Drop all the outdoor gathering limitations because they've basically already done that. So there's no justification for picking and choosing which groups of people get to congregate outdoors.
Christopher Ferrara, thank you so much. He's with the Thomas More Society and fighting for your religious freedoms, at least in New York. And may there be 1,000 of these that are brought around the country. Christopher, thank you so much.
You're welcome.